Okay, hello. So I'm going to be doing lab exercise 12 now, which is Introduction to JavaScript. Hooray. So let's share my screen. Do, 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 do. And sure, entire screen. There we go. Ta-da. Okay, so now you can see what I'm doing. All right, so in this exercise, we're going to cover the scripting language JavaScript. And essentially what JavaScript does is it allows you to add dynamic content to web pages. For example, things like you click a button, a message, or a pop-up window appears. So script is just a little bit of executable code that works within a web page. And the two basic styles of scripting are client side, where the script runs on the client machine, that would be on your machine, and the other one is server side, where it runs on a server. Common use for server-side scripts like PHP, if you've ever heard of that one, is to somehow dynamically update a web page prior to delivering it to the client machine. Anyway, in this lab exercise, we're going to do some things in JavaScript, which is the most widely used client scripting language. So first thing we're going to do, go to this link here. It's at the w3schools.com site, which is, by the way, a great place to start learning about JavaScript. Over here in this window on the left, this is the source code. This is the code that will create the web page that appears on this side. Essentially what we have is this is the code that we're editing, and over here is the results. So first thing we do is we can just copy all of this and paste it into the window here. So we'll just select all, and normally, if we wanted to be pure about this, we could just overwrite the body or, just put in the body part of the document, but it actually works. It's pretty, HTML is pretty forgiving, so we can actually just copy over the whole thing and ignore the document part. So when we run this, we see the code has a header over here. It has a paragraph with some text about conures, which is basically a kind of parrot, and then 4 buttons down below. Now what we're going to do in this exercise is we'll create some actions that happen whenever we click on these buttons. Okay, first thing is we're going to allow changing some elements on the page. We're going to change characteristics of the elements on the page. For example, one thing we can do is we can change a label that appears on a button. So all of these buttons, right, they have their little labels, label, color, Latin, image, and we can change that. So this first one I'll come back and I'll explain what happens in a moment, but the first thing we're going to do is on the label button, we're going to replace its line with this. I'll talk about what that does. Highlight that, paste over it. Now if we want to run this, click run. Okay, even though the page all looks the same, we've added what's called an on-click attribute to our button. That means potentially something can happen when we click on it. So let's click on our label button here. Ah, it changes the text to new label. All right, let's break down what happened here. So originally, right, we didn't have this on-click attribute. We replaced it with it. On-click just means what's going to happen when you click on this web object, in this case, a button. Well, in this, we're going to change its inner HTML attribute to read new label. Okay, so this just means the object itself. So whatever button or other web object this is, if you put on click in the on click attribute this dot whatever, that just means the object itself. So the object whose on click attribute we're talking about. The inner HTML for buttons, it can be different for other web objects, but for buttons, it's just the text inside the two tags, right? We have our opening tag, we have our closing tag, and inner HTML is just this word label. So instead of having label as its inner HTML, which it originally was, we update that to new label, which we saw happen here. We do that again, do run, click label, boom, it appears as new label. Now, the on-click attribute, notice on the outside, it's encased in double quotes. Well, that's actually pretty important. HTML likes to use double quotes for everything. JavaScript will let you use double or single quotes pretty equivalently. But if you put in double quotes here for new label, then HTML would think, oh, this is where the on-click attribute ends, right? It would just end this dot inner HTML, hit that first double quote there, and think it was done. And you'd have a syntax error and the code wouldn't do what it was supposed to do. So since in this onClick attribute, we're actually putting a little bit of JavaScript in here, we just enclose the new label with single quotes. And that way, the web browser can JavaScript part of this onClick attribute from the HTML that it's encased in. Okay. Anyway, so that's all pretty much here. I will mention this when you're doing this text in your HTML or JavaScript files, it is very important that you use straight vertical quotes, right? So not if you have it in Microsoft Word, for example, we have a couple here that are not straight vertical, right? If you look close, you can see they're curled a little bit. They need to be straight vertical because otherwise things will be very wrong. It won't recognize them as the kind of characters that you think they are. Okay, so be careful with doing that for Word. Generally, you're safe putting it in some sort of unformatted text document like Notepad. All right, so next we can do is we can change object attributes by using their ID attribute. So any tag in HTML, you can give it an ID attribute that allows scripts to locate it. So the general format for this is document.getElementID and whatever the ID name is. Here it's thing, but it could be whatever it is. And then dot attribute, the attribute of that object you want to change. So for example, we can do this with a font tag. We can put this at the very top of our code, and we can give this font the ID D1. Okay, so let's go back to our try it editor. Up here, the very first line, we're going to paste that in. And this won't actually have any effect because it appears above everything. Okay, it's above, it doesn't, it's just a font tag, which basically says, here's a place where I can display a certain kind of font. But in this case, since there's nothing in it, it doesn't really affect anything. It's sort of this self-contained element. However, if we change its inner HTML attribute, we can make text appear. Okay, so for example, this line button Latin, we can replace its right, we can replace its code with this. And now we've given that button an onClick attribute, so it's going to find that web object with the HTML tag with the ID D1, which is this font here in the first line, and it's going to set its inner HTML to read the Latin name of the sun conure. So we click that to run, okay, and we click Latin, boom, that text appears at the top, right? Prior to doing that, the inner HTML was just nothing up there, right? But we've set its inner HTML to display this kind of text. Now this works with other tags. For example, we could do a paragraph tag here, change font to paragraph. P is for paragraph, and it works the same way, right? Again, a paragraph tag at the start isn't going to do anything, but when you click Latin, boom, same thing, inner HTML updates to that change. Okay, so again, put that back to font like the exercise says. Other things you can do with JavaScript are functions where you have multiple statements grouped together. So if you're going to do that, you need to encase that code into a script tag. Now you can have scripts that contain multiple functions, but typically when you set up a function, it's going to include multiple JavaScript statements. And a function needs to have a few things. It needs to have a name so that other scripts know how to call it. And it can have variables that are sent along from other functions or whenever you call the function called parameters. Parameters get received by the function and processed in some way. So the general format for this is inside a script tag, you have your function name, any parameters that are sent or that are received from other calls, and then all the statements inside there, and finally close out the script tag. Now, there's a bunch of different ones you can do. You can write your own in JavaScript. If you take IDS 313 with me in the fall, we have a big chunk of the course where we learn JavaScript. We also learn some PHP. So that's something if you want to learn more about this. Okay, now it can be done by something like a user action like clicking, or it can be done by something that happens independently of the user like a timer ticking. Either way, when the function happens, the general way you call it to make that function happen is you call the function name and you send in along any arguments. So arguments are things that you send along with a function call. So let's do an example. So the opening paragraph, right? We're going to give it an ID P1. So that initial tag P, we're going to give it the ID P1. So let's do this. We already have the paragraph in there. Go back to our page. We're going to copy over this P like that. Boom. Okay, that's not going to change anything. It just has a P1 tag there, P1 ID. Okay, now we're going to create in the tag for the color button the property onClick equals G. So let's do that. Where's our color button? It's there. So here for button onClick equals G. And then for G, we're calling that function. Okay, but we don't have the function yet, but if somebody clicks on it, we're going to call this function called G. And since the space between the parentheses is empty, is blank, we're not sending any arguments along with the function call. So we're keeping it simple. Finally, at the end, right, at the end of the HTML code, include the following script. All right, let's do that. Okay, here we have function G, and we're doing the few things. So document.getElementById P1 style color equals red. Really just one statement, but that's okay. So we're going to find this P1 tag. Here it is, right? The tag with the ID P1. And within that, we're going to set its color attribute to display as red. Easy. So let's run this. Okay, we'll verify it. So when we click on color, boom, changes to red, like magic. All right. Now variables. So JavaScript variables are indicated by the word var. So var, short for variable. You may find a lot of people pronounce it as var. There's certainly a an age gap thing with that, but you know, some people like calling it uh, var. I would say probably most people call it var, but in my own head, I always called it var. And of course, it's, you know, an abbreviation for variable, so it was natural to call it that for me. Anyway, you'll find many people in uh, this sort of pronunciation issue out there in the real world. Okay, so anyway, a variable is just a virtual container for data. If you've never programmed a computer before, a variable is just like memory on your calculator. You can store some value in it, and then when you want to retrieve it, you know, you have a way to retrieve it from memory. So if you want to specify a variable in JavaScript, first you have to declare it. Basically, you have to notify the code in some way that the name you've given the variable actually refers to a var and is not just, you know, some text or some other standalone code. So simple way to do that, to declare it, something like var x, or if you want, you can assign it a value like var x equals 0 or 1.1, or you can have Boolean variables that are true, false, so var x equals false, or give it a string of text like var x equals some text. JavaScript is pretty flexible for that. There, it basically adapts the code to whatever kind of data you've given. Other languages like Java, not so forgiving. You have to make sure that the variable's type matches the data that it's given. But for JavaScript, you don't have to worry about that. Okay. Anyway, so here's the action that we're going to do. So at the end of the HTML code already in place, we're going to add this code. What this does adds a couple blank lines from the BR tags, then two buttons. Okay, one of them is going to just when it's clicked, it's going to call this function f, and that's going to be labeled add. The other one is going to have the ID val is going to display the value. Okay, so our script says initially x is 0. If we call this function f, we're going to receive a parameter y, right? So when we first call it, we're sending along x as the value to the function, and we know x is 0. Every time we call that function, we're going to increment x by 1. So we're going to say x equals y plus 1. Okay, so this x is the same var x that's there. And then document get element by ID val, we're going to display its inner HTML as the current value of x. All right, so all we're doing, we're incrementing x by 1 each time we click that button. So I'll put that at the end of the code. And I thought I needed to do that. And we'll run it. So if we do this, if we do value, okay, it's not really going to do anything. We don't have an on click for value there. But if we do add, it's going to display, right? Every time I'm clicking on that, it adds one to the value. Clicking on the value button itself does nothing. Okay. So that's it. That's an example of variables and function calls and sending along an argument and receiving it as a parameter for that function. Okay. Couple more things, then we'll be done. So intervals. Sometimes you might want a timer to do something on your page, right? The timer ticks down, and when the timer is done, boom, something happens, right? So for example, if on some regular refresh cycle, like every few seconds, you want to call your server and see if there's been something updated on the page, like an updated stock price or sports or something like that, you can have a timer do that. And the way JavaScript does that, there's a couple variations of this function, set interval. Okay, so set interval is essentially going to call a function every so often, right? The time is the periodicity. So for this one, we're going to first specify a button with an ID B. Okay, when that button is clicked, it's going to call another function h, which uses a set interval function with an interval of 100 milliseconds. So every 100 milliseconds, the current time gets incremented. Okay, so this one we have a separate script. Notice that these scripts don't really interfere with each other. So here we'll have another script, var x is 0. In this function, we're going to do this, set interval function, var y equals time plus x divided by 10. Right, basically we're just going to display the time in fractions of seconds. So whatever the time is, and then we're going to display x divided by 10. So every one of those is going to be a tenth of a second, and we're going to add it. We're going to convert that to a string. Right, if it ends in 0, we're going to add the text at the end, 0.0, and we're going to update that string text to display the current value. And so again, every 100 milliseconds is going to get updated. Let's do this in our code. Okay, so now we have a new one, timer. Again, if we call timer, we're going to call the set interval function. We're going to initially have a var y, which is going to equal it's some text. It's going to say time plus x divided by 10. And if x modulo 10 is 0, that means if it's evenly divisible by 10, we're going to add a 0.0 to the end. So if it's x is 0, it's going to display as 0.0. If x is 1, it's going to display as 1.0, so on. Okay? And then we're going to say y equals y plus s, right? And s there inside quotes. We're going to attach the letter s to our string, so it looks like it's in seconds. Okay, then for this get element by ID B, we're going to display on this button, it's inner HTML here, instead of displaying timer, is going to display how many seconds have elapsed. And then we're going to do that with a periodicity of 100 milliseconds, so every 100 milliseconds it's going to update. So we click timer, and it starts running. Okay, and it just keeps on going basically as long as we want to let it go. We can just let this sit there and let it do its thing for a while. But if we want to zero it out, we could just hit, you know, run again. Okay, and then we run our script from the start where it's again all set to 0 and the timer isn't running. Okay, last thing, we're going to do this. Copy and paste all your HTML to a notepad file. So let's do that. We're going to put that in some notepad. We're going to copy all this code here into notepad, copy and paste. And then at the very end, we're going to put this line, okay, image ID equals square, source is red square.jpg. So when we do this, we can save this as LX12. Okay, what do we got here? Sure, let's do it as LX12. Put it in here. Okay, so LX12.html, and remember to save as type all files. So we do that. Now in this folder, we do have a red square.jpg. So if we save it, okay, and we open back up here and we run it, boom, we have this red square display. Ta-da! All right, now if we wanted to have it appear on a new line, if we wanted to change that a little bit, of course, we could do something like implement a paragraph tag there, something like that. Otherwise, it just runs on the line right after timer. Okay, so if we didn't want it to look like that, we could put it on a separate line, but no big deal either way. Anyway, the task, right, here's what we have. So we have this image here. Its ID is square. Its source is red square.jpg, right? That's the source of the image. So can you write a script that will display the blue square.jpg image? Interesting question. Right, hey, I'm gonna change all these. So the way that would work, if you think about it, number one, you would need to write a script, a little bit of JavaScript that finds this particular tag, right, with the ID is square, and then change its source attribute to the red square.jpg, right? Instead of change it to blue square instead of the red square that it currently is. So that would be your tag to try to figure that out. So if someone clicks the image button, you make sure that it displays the blue square JPEG, and make sure you have that in your folder, otherwise it's not going to work. So once you think you have it, save your text file to an HTML file, close Notepad, open your HTML file, try clicking on the image button and see what happens. I try to make that work. Okay, good luck. This concludes our exercise. See you all next time. Bye.